And did you believe in God?
Oh, yes.
Do you now believe in God?
Now? Difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know.
This exchange occurred during a 1959 BBC interview program called Face to Face, renowned for its intimate, unadorned style. The host, John Freeman, had a reputation for asking piercing questions that aimed to peel back the public persona of his subjects. He skillfully shifted the conversation from Jung's childhood as a pastor's son, a time when belief was expected, to the present, putting the elderly psychologist, who was in his 80s, on the spot. Jung's pause, followed by his quiet, confident assertion, was therefore a moment of profound, unscripted honesty, rather than a prepared theological statement. Delivered into millions of homes, this unexpected claim landed with the force of a thunderclap. In a world accustomed to framing the divine in terms of faith, belief, and mystery, Jung's claim to know was both electrifying and deeply unsettling. It bypassed centuries of theological debate and positioned the experience of God not as a matter of faith to be accepted, but as a reality to be encountered. The statement created an immediate uproar, prompting an avalanche of letters from a public both fascinated and perplexed, compelling Jung to spend the remainder of his life clarifying what he truly meant by this deceptively simple statement. In the aftermath of the interview, facing a deluge of correspondence, Jung penned a letter to the Listener magazine, published on January 21, 1960. This letter stands as his most complete and definitive explanation of his position. He begins by acknowledging the controversy and positioning himself as a modern thinker, struggling to interpret ancient concepts in a new era. So many letters I have received have emphasized my statement about knowing of God. My opinion about knowledge of God is an unconventional way of thinking, and I quite understand if it should be suggested that I am no Christian. Yet I think of myself as a Christian since I'm entirely based upon Christian concepts. I only try to escape their internal contradictions by introducing a more modest attitude, which takes into consideration the immense darkness of the human mind. The Christian idea proves its vitality by a continuous evolution, just like Buddhism. Our time certainly demands some new thought in this respect, as we cannot continue to think in an antique or medieval way when we enter the sphere of religious experience. Jung's self-identification as a Christian requires understanding his complex relationship with Christianity. His father and several uncles were Swiss Reformed pastors, yet Jung found their faith hollow, lacking the direct experience of the numinous. His extensive studies of Gnosticism, particularly texts like the Pistis Sophia and his own Gnostic-inspired work 7 Sermons to the Dead, written under the pseudonym Basilides, revealed to him a Christianity that embraced psychological reality and the problem of evil. The Gnostics, Jung believed, were the first psychologists, recognizing that religious symbols were expressions of psychic processes. His Christianity was thus Gnostic in nature, focused on gnosis, which is direct knowing, rather than pistis, which means faith. By referencing Buddhism alongside Christianity, Jung signals his multicultural approach to religious psychology. His collaborations with scholars like Richard Wilhelm on The Secret of the Golden Flower and his studies of Hinduism, Taoism, and alchemy had shown him that all religions were expressions of the same underlying psychological processes. Jung navigates a delicate position. He doesn't reject Christianity, but seeks to rescue it from its own contradictions. By the immense darkness of the human mind, he points to what his decades of clinical work had revealed: the collective unconscious, the vast realm where the God archetype lives as a dynamic, autonomous force. This darkness isn't evil or sinful in the traditional Christian sense. It is the primordial depth of the psyche, where religious experience actually originates, before it gets codified into dogma and doctrine. It echoes both the Gnostic notion of the unknown God beyond all categories and the Buddhist concept of sunyata, emptiness, which points to the ultimate reality that transcends any conceptual understanding. Jung's more modest attitude is actually quite radical. Instead of claiming to know God's nature through revelation or scripture, he limits himself to what can be empirically observed in the psyche. Yet this modesty paradoxically leads to a more immediate certainty. But it is not the certainty of belief, it is the certainty of direct encounter. When he insists that Christianity must evolve, he's arguing that modern people, having eaten from the tree of psychological knowledge, can no longer return to the naive faith of earlier centuries. They must find God through the psyche or not at all. He then moves to clarify his statement from the BBC interview, drawing a crucial distinction between theological claims and psychological facts. I did not say in the broadcast, "There is a God." I said, "I do not need to believe in God, I know." Which does not mean I do know a certain God, Zeus, Yahweh, Allah, the Trinitarian God, etc. But rather, I do know that I am obviously confronted with a factor unknown in itself, which I call God in consensu omnium, consent of everyone. Quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus creditur, what has been believed always, everywhere, and by all. I remember him, I evoke him, whenever I use his name overcome by anger or by fear, whenever I involuntarily say, "O God." This passage contains Jung's most sophisticated epistemological move. The factor unknown in itself is his phenomenological masterstroke. He brackets the metaphysical question entirely. Like Kant's thing in itself, this factor can be known only through its effects, never in its essence. But unlike Kant, who relegated God to the realm of practical reason, Jung locates this factor squarely in empirical psychological experience. The archetype isn't God in the theological sense, but it's the psychological structure through which humanity has always experienced what it calls God. It's as if Jung discovered that the human psyche has a God-shaped receptor, and this receptor's activation is so universal, so consistent across cultures and millennia, that it constitutes a form of knowing more certain than belief. The spontaneous cry of "O God" in extremity erupts from depths older than civilization and language. This is the consensu omnium, not that everyone believes the same thing about God, but that everyone's psyche is structured to produce experiences of the numinous. Jung's listing of various deities such as Zeus, Yahweh, Allah, and the Trinitarian God demonstrates his phenomenological approach to comparative religion. Each represents a cultural clothing of the same underlying archetype, which he elsewhere calls the God image, or imago Dei, inherent in the human psyche. His years of studying world mythologies, from African tribes to ancient Egyptian mysteries, had convinced him that the God archetype manifests universally but takes countless cultural forms. The Latin phrase quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus creditur carries profound historical weight. Originally formulated by Vincent of Lerins in the 5th century as a test for Catholic orthodoxy, the Vincentian canon, Jung repurposes it psychologically. Where Vincent meant doctrinal universality within the Church, Jung means psychological universality across all humanity. He's suggesting that what makes something psychologically true is its appearance across all times, semper, all places ubique, and all peoples ab omnibus. This is exactly the definition of an archetype. Having established what he is not claiming, Jung proceeds to describe what this God actually is in experience. That happens when I meet somebody or something stronger than myself. It is an apt name given to all overpowering emotions in my own psychical system, subduing my conscious will and usurping control over myself. This is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. In accordance with tradition, I call the power of fate in this positive as well as negative aspect, and inasmuch as its origin is beyond my control, God, our personal God, since my fate means very much myself, particularly when it approaches me in the form of conscience as a vox Dei, with which I can even converse and argue. We do, and at the same time we know that we do. One is subject as well as object. Here, Jung moves from the abstract to the visceral. He talks about lived experience. When he talks about overpowering emotions, he's describing encounters with autonomous complexes, which are organized clusters of psychic energy that operate independently of conscious will. These complexes are living realities with their own intentionality. When one is seized by a creative vision, overwhelmed by love, or gripped by inexplicable dread, one experiences something that transcends personal psychology. One touches the transpersonal and archetypal. The equation of God with fate is particularly revealing. Jung talks about meaningful necessity, the way life seems to present us with exactly the experiences needed for our psychological development. This is the mystery of individuation, how external events and internal development synchronize in ways that suggest an organizing intelligence beyond conscious comprehension. The personal God emerges precisely here, not as a cosmic person, but as the unique pattern through which the universal self-archetype manifests in an individual life. The reference to Vox Dei, voice of God, connects Jung to a long mystical tradition. From the biblical still small voice heard by Elijah to the Socratic daimonion, from Augustine's interior intimo meo, more inward than my innermost self, to the Quaker inner light, humanity has recognized an inner voice that transcends ego consciousness. Jung's clinical work had shown him that this voice often emerges in dreams, active imagination, and moments of crisis, speaking with an authority the ego recognizes as superior to itself. This is the psychological reality behind religious experiences of divine communication. The parenthetical observation, we do, and at the same time, we know that we do. One is subject as well as object. Captures the peculiar doubling of consciousness in these moments. We act and observe ourselves acting. We experience and witness our experience. This split awareness is itself evidence of the psyche's transpersonal dimension, the presence of an observing self that transcends the experiencing ego. This parallels the fundamental insight of mystical traditions worldwide. In Vedantic philosophy, this is the witness consciousness, saksin, that observes even as it participates. In Zen, it's the recognition that the observer and the observed are one. In Western mysticism, Meister Eckhart spoke of the eye with which we see God being the same eye with which God sees us. Jung had experienced this doubling of consciousness in his own confrontation with the unconscious between 1913 to 1917, when he engaged in dialogues with inner figures like Philemon and the serpent, while simultaneously maintaining scientific observation of the process. Finally, Jung concludes with both a warning about intellectual precision and his ultimate vision of the divine. Yet, I should consider it an intellectual immorality to indulge in the belief that my view of a God is the universal, metaphysical being of the confessions or philosophies. I do neither commit the impertinence of a hypostasis, nor of an arrogant qualification such as God can only be good. Only my experience can be good or evil, but I know that the superior will is based upon a foundation which transcends human imagination. Since I know of my collision with a superior will in my own psychical system, I know of God. And if I should venture the illegitimate hypostasis of my image, I would say of a God beyond good and evil, just as much dwelling in myself as everywhere else. Deus est circulus cuius centrum est ubique, qui circumferentia vero nusquam. God is a circle whose center is everywhere, but whose circumference is nowhere. Jung's insistence on avoiding hypostasis, which is the projection of subjective experience onto objective reality, isn't skepticism but precision. He knows the boundaries of the psychologist. He can map the territory of human experience, but cannot leap from that map to claims about ultimate reality. This intellectual immorality, he warns against, is the confusion of psychological fact with metaphysical truth, the error of taking one's personal or cultural image of God and declaring it universal. The phrase, God can only be good, is an expression of the doctrine of summum bonum, highest good, codified by Thomas Aquinas as privatio boni, or the idea that evil is merely the absence of good rather than a positive reality. This theological position had troubled Jung since childhood, when he had a vision of God defecating on Basel Cathedral. His studies of Gnosticism, which recognized the reality of evil in figures like the Demiurge, and his clinical observations of the shadow side of the psyche, convinced him that any authentic God image must encompass darkness as well as light. His controversial work, Answer to Job, explored how even the biblical God contained a dark side that theology struggled to acknowledge. If you want to explore this work in more depth, I have a video essay specifically dedicated to it. Jung's God Beyond Good and Evil contradicts the moral absolutism of traditional theology. The self, as the totality of the psyche, must encompass all opposites, including creation and destruction, light and shadow, peace and war, love and hate. This is psychological completeness for Jung. A God limited to goodness would be a partial God, an ego projection, rather than an encounter with the terrible wholeness of reality. Jung had seen too much in his patience, in himself, and in the catastrophes of 2 world wars to accept a sanitized deity. The God he knows includes the darkness, integrates the shadow, and encompasses the coincidentia oppositorum that characterizes all genuine psychological transformation. The magnificent closing image, Deus est circulus cuius centrum est ubique, cuius circumferentia vero nusquam, crystallizes Jung's entire position. This God is simultaneously the most intimate reality, living in the depths of every psyche, even closer than breath, and at the same time the most transcendent mystery, forever beyond conceptual grasp. It's a God found through a courageous encounter with one's own psychological depths. This is what Jung knows, a psychological fact so undeniable, so empirically verifiable in the laboratory of human experience, that belief becomes almost insulting to the reality of the encounter. This closing image has ancient roots, attributed variously to Saint Bonaventure, Hermes Trismegistus, and Empedocles, and found in the medieval Book of the 24 Philosophers. It became central to mystical theology through figures like Nicholas of Cusa and Giordano Bruno. The symbol resonates with the monad of Pythagorean and Hermetic tradition, represented as the circle with a point at its center representing the One, used alchemically for gold and astrologically for the sun, both symbols of divine consciousness. In other words, God. I might add that parallels with the Ouroboros could be drawn. The Ouroboros is the serpent eating its tail that is encountered repeatedly in alchemical texts, a symbol of the eternal cycle, the union of opposites and the self as totality. Like the infinite circle, the Ouroboros represents something simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, beginning and end, and the coincidentia oppositorum, coincidence of opposites, that characterizes the deepest psychological truths. I created a comprehensive video essay on the Ouroboros as well, if you dare to watch. This paradoxical God centered everywhere yet bounded nowhere perfectly captures Jung's psychological theology. The self-archetype dwells at the center of every individual psyche, centrum est ubique, while transcending all individual limitations, circumferentia vero nusquam. It's personal and transpersonal, immanent and transcendent, knowable through experience yet ultimately mysterious. This is what Jung knows, a psychological reality verified through clinical observation, personal experience, and cross-cultural study. A knowing that emerges from the marriage of scientific empiricism with the wisdom of mystical traditions spanning millennia. Now that we have established what Jung meant by his statement on knowing God, we can move forward to another segment of the 1959 BBC interview. Freeman naturally leads Jung to another great metaphysical question, this time concerning the finality of death. Freeman's question is direct, seeking a personal conviction or belief about the afterlife. Jung responds with his empirical method, demonstrating that his stance on God was not a one-off provocation, but a consistent philosophical principle.
Do you yourself believe that death is probably the end, or do you believe that...
Well, I can't say. You see, the word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis. Either I know a thing, and when I know it, I don't need to believe it. If I don't allow myself, for instance, to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it. I can't believe it. But when there are sufficient reasons for a certain hypothesis, I shall accept these reasons, naturally, and should say we have to reckon with the possibility of so-and-so, you know.
Thus, Jung pivots from the certainty of knowing God as a psychic factor to the intellectual honesty of forming a hypothesis about death. He did not claim to know what happens after death in the same way he knows of the God archetype's immediate impact on the psyche. The God archetype is an ever-present factor in life. Death, on the other hand, is a future event, a horizon. Therefore, it requires a different epistemological tool, not direct knowing, but a carefully constructed hypothesis based on evidence. Jung's statement, "I don't allow myself to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it," is a direct critique of belief as a form of psychological comfort or wishful thinking. For him, belief without evidence is intellectually immoral, a refusal to face the unknown with courage. He is separating himself from both the dogmatic believer who accepts doctrine without question and the dogmatic materialist who insists death is the end without examining the counter-evidence. His standard is rigorous. "I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis," he states. For Jung, the empiricist, these reasons are pieces of phenomenological evidence gathered over a lifetime of clinical practice and personal experience. So, what are these reasons that allow him to form a hypothesis of continuation? Jung observed that the unconscious, particularly as it expresses itself in dreams, does not seem to experience time linearly or be bound by the physical constraints of space. Dreams can bring back the dead as if they were alive and offer insights that transcend the dreamer's personal knowledge. This suggested to him that the psyche operates in a dimension where the rules of physical dissolution may not apply. Jung was deeply interested in the experiences of his patients near death. He noted that they often had visions or dreams, such as dreams of traveling or preparing for a journey, that indicated a psychological preparation for a transition. They did not feel they were facing annihilation. Yet, his own near-death experience is perhaps the most significant reason. In 1944, after a severe heart attack, Jung had a profound out-of-body experience. He described floating high above the earth, seeing the planet in its shimmering blue light, and feeling he was approaching a temple where he would meet all the people from his life and understand the context of his existence. He was called back to life by a manifestation of his doctor, feeling immense disappointment at having to return. This direct personal encounter with a state of consciousness, independent of his critically ill body, became the unshakable foundation for his hypothesis. As you already know, Jung saw human life as a process of individuation, of becoming whole and realizing the self. He questioned whether this complex teleological process, which often intensifies in the second half of life, would simply be cut short with no purpose. The psychological evidence suggested that life was a preparation. To him, it seemed more logical that the state of consciousness achieved during life had some form of continuity. Ultimately, this evidence does not lead Jung to a dogmatic belief in heaven or reincarnation. Instead, it leads him to a carefully worded, scientific-sounding conclusion. We have to reckon with the possibility of so-and-so. This is the voice of the phenomenologist. He has gathered the data from dreams, myths, clinical work, and his own near-death experience, and concluded that the hypothesis of simple extinction is insufficient. The evidence points to something more. Therefore, as a responsible scientist of the psyche, he argues that we must remain open to the possibility of continuity. He doesn't believe in an afterlife. He has sufficient reason to hypothesize that consciousness is not coextensive with the physical body. This stance is one of profound intellectual humility, but it is not a vague hope. It is a conclusion based on the observable evidence that the psyche is a reality far stranger and more mysterious than a purely materialistic worldview can accommodate. Another fascinating lens through which to view these ideas emerges from a 1955 Daily Mail interview. In this conversation, Jung translates his far-reaching psychological framework into the language of intimate personal reality, bridging the gap between his complex theories and everyday life. He first grounds the abstract God archetype in the most intimate of human experiences. Without knowing it, man is always concerned with God. What some people call instinct or intuition is nothing other than God. God is that voice inside us which tells us what to do and what not to do. In other words, our conscience. This is a populist formulation of the Vox Dei he described in his 1960 letter. By equating God with instinct and intuition, Jung demystifies the divine, framing it as a constant biological and psychological reality. The experience of the divine becomes visceral and immediate. It is the gut feeling, the inexplicable hunch, the unmistakable tug of conscience, the moral compass that guides and restrains. God in this sense is an ever-present psychological function or a universal human faculty. The knowing Jung speaks of is rooted in this fundamental capacity to listen to an inner, guiding voice. This confirms that the knowing Jung speaks of is not reserved for mystics. It is an ever-present function of the human psyche, an inner voice accessible to anyone willing to listen. From this internal compass, Jung then turns to the external path it creates, describing how a life's events reveal a coherent, meaningful story. The fact is that what happens to a person is characteristic of him. He represents a pattern and all the pieces fit. One by one, as his life proceeds, they fall into place according to some predestined design. This is a beautiful, potent and poetic description of individuation. The predestined design is the inevitable, organic and purposeful unfolding of the self. The unique innate blueprint within each person actualizing itself through the events of a lifetime. Much like an acorn is predestined to become an oak, it is the ultimate expression of the personal God we discussed earlier, a transcendent organizing principle that shapes the narrative of a life. Every event, every joy and sorrow, and every seemingly random encounter becomes a puzzle piece falling into place, revealing the coherent and unique pattern of who that person was always meant to be. Taken together, these quotes provide a perfect synthesis. The first internalizes God as our most intimate guide, while the second externalizes that guidance as the meaningful story of our life. For Jung, then, the goal was clear: to help modern individuals escape the crisis of faith by discovering the divine in the instinctual wisdom of their own hearts and the undeniable unfolding pattern of their own lives. But perhaps no single phrase better encapsulates Jung's entire psychological attitude than the inscription he carved in stone over the door of his house in Zurich. In a 1960 letter, he clarified its origin, noting that he acquired a 16th century edition of Erasmus's Adagia, where it was featured when he was just 19. Its classical pagan roots and Jung's lifelong ownership of the text make it clear that it has a deep personal significance. The inscription reads, "Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit," whether summoned or not, God will be present. A foundational statement of psychological reality. For Jung, Deus, God, is the name for the objective psyche, the unconscious, the self, the vast autonomous power that operates independently of our ego's awareness or approval. The inscription presents the two fundamental ways we encounter this power. The path of vocatus, summoned, is the path of conscious engagement. It is the work of individuation. Turning inward through analysis, dreamwork, and active imagination to intentionally invite a dialogue with this inner force. It is the courageous act of facing the contents of the psyche, seeking relationship and understanding. The path of non-vocatus, not summoned, describes what happens when this inner power is ignored, repressed, or projected. Instead of vanishing, this force manifests in our lives in disguise. It erupts from within as a neurosis or an overpowering complex. It confronts us from the outside as fate, appearing as a seemingly random event that shatters our plans. Yet, as Jung clarified in his letter, the certainty of the god's arrival raises a far more critical question. In what form and to what purpose? The encounter is guaranteed, but its nature is ambiguous and uncertain. It may bring healing or destruction, creative inspiration or madness. This profound uncertainty leads directly to the second, equally important saying Jung associated with the first, which he said was the true reason for the carving and what he wanted his patients to remember. Timor Dei initium sapientiae. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Here, fear means something far deeper than fright. It signifies awe, reverence, and a sober humility in the face of a power that is vastly greater and more powerful than the ego. It is the ego's recognition of its own smallness and vulnerability before the might of the self. This awe is the beginning of wisdom, because true wisdom begins only when the ego relinquishes its inflation and its arrogant assumption of being the master of the psychic house. It is the prerequisite for any authentic relationship with the unconscious. This awe-filled path, Jung insists, is distinct from institutional religion. He concludes that this road leads not the approach to Christianity, but to God himself, and this seems to be the ultimate question. This is the culmination of his life's work, forging a path that bypasses dogma to facilitate a direct, unmediated, and often terrifying encounter with the divine as it lives and moves within the human soul. The inscription on his door was thus a constant reminder. The psyche is a living God whose presence is unavoidable. One can only choose to approach it with the wisdom born of awe, or be met by it unawares. Jung's declaration, "I know," reverberates through all his work as both a methodological principle and a lived reality. We explored his careful distinction between psychological empiricism and metaphysical speculation, his recognition of the God archetype as an autonomous factor in the psyche, his hypothesis about death based on observable phenomena, and his understanding of individuation as the revelation of a predestined pattern. But this represents merely the threshold of his vast exploration into the religious function of the psyche. This essay has only scratched the surface of Jung's extensive writings on this subject. Consider the depths we haven't plumbed. His concept of synchronicity as meaningful coincidences that suggest a causal connecting principle linking psyche and matter, inner and outer worlds. The moments when the universe seems to know and respond to our psychological state. Or his notion of the unus mundus, that unified reality underlying both psyche and matter, where the distinction between subject and object dissolves into a primordial wholeness. This is the realm from which synchronicities emerge, where the God Jung knows operates within the psyche and through the fabric of reality. We haven't explored the full implications of the transcendent function, which is the psychological mechanism that bridges conscious and unconscious, creating symbols that unite opposites and facilitate the transformation Jung called individuation. Active imagination, Jung's empirical method for deliberately engaging this function, allows one to literally converse with the God image as it manifests in personified form. The transcendent function operates spontaneously in dreams and fantasies, but through active imagination, one consciously participates in this bridging process. When Jung spoke with Philemon, his inner wise old man with kingfisher wings, or encountered the prophet Elijah and the blind Salome in the depths of his Red Book experiences, he was not believing in these figures, but knowing them as psychological realities more vivid than everyday life. It was the transcendent function made conscious through deliberate imaginative engagement. However, I've narrated Jung's essay on the transcendent function, and the link is available in the description. Consider his profound meditation on Abraxas, the Gnostic deity who transcends the Christian division of God and devil, generating both truth and lie, good and evil, light and darkness with the same word and the same act. In Abraxas, Jung found a symbol for the terrible creative force that births all opposites without being bound by them. Unlike the pleroma, which is the primordial fullness where all opposites cancel each other out into nothingness, Abraxas is the active god of paradox and the generative power that creates distinction itself. This is the god who is more indefinite than God or devil, yet more actual than either, embodying the amoral creative force of the psyche that produces both salvation and destruction. I've also created a dedicated exploration of this powerful symbol in another video essay, for those drawn to venture further into these depths. Jung's assertion that the psyche is the greatest of all cosmic wonders and the sine qua non of the world as an object, from structure and dynamics of the psyche, points to his radical claim. Psychic reality is as real as physical reality, maybe even more real. Dreams, visions, and active imagination are not just subjective fantasies, but encounters with an objective psyche that has its own autonomous life and wisdom. This psychic objectivity is what allows Jung to know, because we are dealing with observable psychological facts. His distinction between directed thinking and fantasy thinking illuminates another dimension of his epistemology. While directed thinking follows the laws of logic and causality, fantasy thinking, the natural mode of the unconscious, operates through images, symbols, and mythological patterns. This mythological thinking isn't primitive or inferior, but the psyche's natural way of apprehending truths that transcend rational categories. The God Jung knows is encountered through this imaginal cognition, not through theological argumentation. We must also acknowledge Answer to Job, his most controversial work, where Jung psychologically analyzes Yahweh's treatment of Job, arguing that God himself needs to become conscious. The divine depends on human consciousness for its own moral development. Here, Jung's knowing becomes almost unbearably radical. He knows God not as a perfect being, but as a paradoxical reality that includes darkness, unconsciousness, and the need for transformation. What Jung ultimately offers us is a phenomenology of the sacred, a way of encountering the divine through the empirical reality of our own psychological depths. He shows us that the choice is between a conscious relationship with the autonomous psyche or unconscious possession by it. The God that Jung knows is neither the projection of human wishes nor a metaphysical abstraction, but a living psychological reality that manifests in dreams, synchronicities, moral imperatives, creative inspiration, and the meaningful pattern of individual life. His legacy forces us to approach our own inner life with the same empirical rigor and reverent awe that he brought to his. Can we, like Jung, distinguish between what we merely believe and what we truly know from experience? Can we face the superior will that moves through our psychological depths without either inflating into identification with it or deflating into denial of it? Can we recognize, as Jung did, that the self, or the archetype of wholeness, and the regulating center of the psyche, is phenomenologically indistinguishable from the God image? These questions remain as urgent today as they were when Jung first articulated them. In our age of both religious fundamentalism and materialist reductionism, Jung's middle path, empirical yet open to mystery, scientific yet honoring the numinous, offers a way forward, not toward a new dogma, but toward direct encounter with the living reality of the psyche. This brings us to the end of our journey through Jung's profound statement. If you found value in this exploration, please like and subscribe and activate the notification bell to join me for future video essays. Share this with others who might benefit from these ideas, and please share your own insights in the comments. Often the most illuminating perspectives come from the audience rather than the creator. If you wish to support Irevelato, which is an independent project funded entirely by those who find meaning in this work, you'll find a link to my Patreon page in the description below. On Patreon, depending on the tier you choose, you can watch all my videos without interruption, participate in monthly questions and answers, access exclusive content, engage in personal monthly video calls, commission essays on topics that captivate you, and even receive full mentorship on the creative process behind these explorations. Regardless of how you choose to engage, thank you for staying until the very end. You're among those rare individuals who don't shy away from depth, complexity, and uncomfortable truths. For that courage to look unflinchingly into the depths, you are extraordinary. Until we meet again in the next exploration, may you know rather than believe.